Alright, we're here with a quick deck tech with Living in Modern before we play a couple of matches. Once again, quick disclaimer, I am hardly a Living in master. I know the basics of the deck, I understand what the deck's trying to do. This is more meant as an illustration for how the deck plays out and show you some of the hate pieces you might run into in sideboard games. And these matchups I think are different enough to kind of show what the deck is capable of taking on some different roles, even though it is primarily a one-trick pony with Living In. Obviously, this deck has the Cascade spells, Violent Outburst and Shardless Agent, which only cascade into Living In. You have a little bit of protection for your combo and disrupting your opponent with things like Force of Negation and Grief. And then the rest of your deck is a bunch of Cyclers, Architects of Will, Curator of Mysteries, Street Wraith, Striped Riverwinder, and Waker of Waves, just putting big beefy boys in the graveyard, trying to get them back. And then Colossus Sky Turtle as a one-of, either to be able to balance your opponent's hate piece, like, you know, they might have a Lavinia or something. I guess Lavinia wouldn't be a good one. You might have some creature that you want to balance. You know, sometimes there's a Ragavan in play you need to buy a little bit of time from. Balance a, is it a Murktide or something? You know, buy yourself a little bit of time in order to be able to combo out. And then, obviously, you also have Otawara as a way to interact with your opponent's planeswalkers like Teferi Hero, Teferi Time Raveler. Sideboard of games, Living In gets hit with a double whammy. Not only do you get hit with Graveyard Hate, Leyline of the Void, Rest in Peace, Relic of Progenitus, Soul Guide Lantern, Endurance. You also have to fight through more permanent-based hate that the Cascade decks have to. So, Chalice of the Void, Void Mirror, Teferi Time Raveler, etc. So, your deck is kind of your sideboard tends to be a kind of a mix of those things. Foundation Breaker, your answer to the hard hate, Leyline of the Void, Rest in Peace, etc. Subtlety helps to answer a couple different angles of attack, helps to answer Endurance on the stack. If they try to blow you out, you can potentially evoke a Subtlety, kind of fight the Endurance that way. Mystical Dispute, this is primarily for fighting against Teferi Time Raveler and against blue counterspells, which can be tricky to fight if you don't have the exactly Violent Outburst plus Force of Negation, especially in Game 1. This gives you a little bit more of an angle of attack, and with the Subtleties, you can kind of play this a little bit of a tempo game. Leyline of the Void kind of serves a couple different purposes. One of the most obvious, it's against other graveyard decks, so against other Living In decks, other Dredge decks, you know, Hollow One decks, etc. It also fights against creature decks that are able to sacrifice their creatures. Now, there's not a ton of creature decks that are able to sacrifice themselves. Obviously, opposing Elementals decks can sacrifice, you know, their incarnations, whether it be, you know, Subtleties, Furies, Endurances, etc. This isn't so much to fight that, it's more to fight like true graveyard decks, but you know, you can bring it in those style matchups or against decks like Goblins that have things with the ability to sacrifice their creatures like Skirk Prospector and Siege Gang Lieutenant or Siege whatever Lieutenant. Just as examples of things that can sacrifice away their board. This kind of takes away that angle of attack, but you know, this is primarily here against other graveyard-based decks. Leyline of Sanctity, primarily here is anti-endurance hate. It can also help against things like Valakut, it can help against things like Burn, etc. It really helps to swing that matchup in a more positive frame, but primarily it's here for things like Endurance, targeted graveyard hate like Tormod's Crypt, etc. Keeps your opponent from being able to target you. Obviously, it's not a be-all, end-all, but, you know, it does help against certain types of graveyard hate. That's why it really pays to know the meta and to know what graveyard hate your opponent will be bringing in against you. That's it. Let's get into some matches and see how we do. Alright, we're back for our first match with Living in Modern. Taking a look at our opening hand. We are on the play. This hand is awkward because we have a lot of what we want. We have Grief to Disrupt, a couple of three Cyclers. So I do think this is a hand you could keep, but it is on the lower end of keeping. And I decide to keep. We lead off on Grief, and our opponent concedes, wanting to gain a little bit of information, but I don't know if that's the correct move, considering there is a couple of different grief decks in the format, although I guess only Living End really griefs without playing a land, so not really a whole lot of information to be gained from this game. Sideboarding. This is an area, admittedly, I'm not exactly sure what gets sideboarded in and out of Living End, as I've only played it for a little bit, but decided to hedge a little bit, boarding out a Striped Overrunner and a Curator Mysteries and Waker of Waves for Foundation Breaker. We don't know what our opponent's on, so we don't know what kind of graveyard hate they could have, if they're playing counter spells, really, if they're playing things like Endurance, etc. So, just taking in a kind of a hedge, we go ahead and do that. Taking a look at this opening hand, it's perfectly reasonable. We have a Cycler, we have, well, 2 Cyclers, we have 2 different Cascade spells, and we have 3 lands, so overall seems like a pretty good hand to keep. Our opponent leads on Castle Garenbrig. Most likely we are up against Amulet Titan, which Foundation Breaker is decent against them, but a little bit awkward. It obviously being sorcery speed. Force of Negation is nice, but most of their graveyard hate tends to be Endurance. So they play Dryad, they play a bounce land, and pass. We will go ahead and cycle some more. Find a Waker of Waves. So we just go ahead and pass here. Might have been correct to do Foundation Breaker, as it was quite likely they had Endurance, but with this opening we have to take the chance to try to get them with Titan. I should have held this Street Wraith, as we at least would have gotten a little bit back with Living End after this Endurance that our opponent's most likely going to cast. Cast Living End, they cast Endurance, pitching a Dryad, so they will get an Endurance back, we get nothing. We do at least get to get rid of their graveyard, or their Primeval Titan and Dryad, but this deck generally finds their pieces fairly easily, so you know, we have to kind of deal with this 4-3 here. And we go ahead and cast Foundation Breaker, blowing up their Urza's Saga. They untap, attack with Endurance, and pass. Or we block. May not have been correct there, as there's no way we're going to successfully cast a Living End the rest of this game. Maybe I was just trying to extend the game, but their deck is fairly well suited to play a grindy mid-range game where we are not, and we really have to rely upon our 1-card combo, and obviously they got us with Endurance this game, so. They have 7 power in play. I mean, we can play a Grief next turn, but it's just going to be on chump block duty, basically. And our opponent plays Crumbling Vestige, the interesting version of it, and just kind of gets to bash in for 4, and we concede because, well, even if we resolve another Living End, I mean, we're getting back a lot of stuff, but our opponent's getting back a Dryad and a Primeval Titan, which is likely lethal at this point. So, Amulet Titan definitely puts you in a bind, and I do believe, if I recall my matchups correctly, that Amulet is at least moderately favored. I know Amulet is heavily favored against Dredge. I'm not 100% sure how the Amulet versus Living End matchup completely goes, because, once again, these are 2 decks that I don't have. I have familiarity with, but I have not played a ton with to know. Alright, now that we have some better idea of what our opponent has going on, we board out the Force of Negations, and we board in the Subtleties and the Foundation Breaker still. Could be possible we're supposed to bring in Leyline of Sanctity against Endurance regardless, but I don't really feel like that accomplishes enough in the matchup. Maybe between that and Valakuturs we're supposed to, but I did feel that Subtlety was a little bit better at the game plan that we're particularly trying to execute in this matchup. Mulligan that first hand. This hand, taking a look at it, a little bit awkward. We have Grief, Foundation Breaker, Subtlety. I think on 6 this might be a mulligan as well, but I guess I choose to keep. Maybe on the strength of the Foundation Breaker. We play Breeding Pool, pass. Opponent leads on Amulet and Urza's Saga. We Foundation Breaker, blow up their Saga. Might be correct to go after the Amulet there, but I feel like the Urza's Saga is going to get them an Amulet anyway, and it's just kind of better to go off their lands. They play Grazer here, which is a little weird. I think they're able to play Dryad off of it, which is good for them, but we just play another Foundation Breaker, blow up their Dryad. Opponent goes Amulet again. We play Sunken Ruins. We hardcast Grief here. Take their Primeval Titan. They have a bunch of nothing in hand now. 2 bounce lands. They play a bounce land. Return a Castle Garenberg to their hand. Do nothing. We now get to play this kind of weird pseudo-tempo game. But unfortunately, we'll really only answer the first Titan for a turn with Subtlety. Striped Riverwinder, not terrible. But I still think we're kind of in this. Do that. Opponent gets a Valakut. Casts a Dryad. We go ahead and Subtlety this. I kind of have to hope to top deck well. We have most of our lands and fetchable lands in play. We top deck another Subtlety. Opponent gets a choice to chump block here. They do. Goes to 11. They play the other bounce land. So at this point, they Summoner's Pact for Primeval Titan, and they just cast Dryad first, which is fine. Obviously, we know their other card in hand's a Titan, so they can't Valakut us. So we go ahead and use Subtlety to time walk them again. Keeping in mind, they will also have to pay for Pact next turn, which will stretch their mana and the ability to recast the Titan. Which, since we drew really, really hot here and drew the third Subtlety, we will win the game. But Violent Outburst alone would win the game, so we win the game on the spot. And that Subtlety was a nice piece of insurance, just in case. But not exactly how the matchup usually goes, but is an interesting way to play around the hate cards, etc. So let's move on to match number 2. Alright, take a look at this opening hand. We are on the play. This hand really doesn't do anything. We have 5 lands and a couple of cyclers, a few too many lands, and really not a whole lot going on. No cascade spells or anything, so this hand's a pretty easy mulligan. This hand, a little bit closer. We have Copy of Living End, which isn't great, but we do have a bunch of cyclers, Force of Negation. This hand's a keep probably on 6, so go ahead and keep bottom of Living End, and lead off on Botanical Sanctum. Opponent leads Unclaimed Territory, Ether Vial on Goblin. So we cycle and counter Ether Vial with Force of Negation just to slow them down. They have Conspicuous Snoop. Go ahead and cast Waker of Waves, looking for lands and cascade spells. We go ahead and cast a Grief, taking their copy of Goblin Matron to keep them from being able to combo on us. They cast Hierarch and attack us. They have Munitions Expert. We have Cascade. They attack. We go ahead and take it. We see if we can get them to commit anything else to the board. They don't, so we cast a big old Violent Outburst and win the game. As we have more than enough power to do anything. They have Munitions Expert, get to kill our Grief. Our Grief gets to take nothing, but we still have more power in play than they do. And Waker of Waves just is kind of embarrassing for them, so we swing in, they jump block. Not sure why they're trying to keep a Matron in play. They get a Sling Gang. Sling Gang does things. We can go ahead and bounce Sling Gang here at the end of turn, I believe. Now they have to choose what they want to do. Again, Violent Outburst, so pretty much no matter what they do, they're in trouble. Also, I bought back a Violent Outburst. Okay. Maybe not the ideal play. We could have easily balanced Sling Gang Lieutenant and forced them into a position where they're in trouble. But they fetch and they die. So that's it for game one. But Goblin decks are usually fairly well prepared for Living End, as they usually have both some type of ley line effect and chalices. So game 2 and game 3 are going to be tricky. As far as sideboarding stuff, like I said, the matchup's tricky. We definitely want Foundation Breaker. We also can bring in Leyline of the Void for a creature deck that puts a lot of creatures in the graveyard. Once again, I'm not entirely sure this is correct. It's possible we should have left in Griefs in order to strip our opponent of Chalices, but once again, Chalices and Leylines are going to generally come down before we can interact with them anyway. We left in Force of Negation specifically for Chalice, which once again may or may not be correct. So that's kind of how we sideboarded. Let me know down in the comments if you play Living End regularly, how you would sideboard in this matchup, knowing of course that, you know, we're facing multiple different versions of hate. So we have an okay 7. It's not the best, but we have a Cascader, we have a Cycler, and we have a utility card in Colossal Sky Turtle. Opponent leads on Leyline of the Void, no shocker there. Leyline of the Void, Ether Vial. We go ahead and pay Botanical Sanctum Pass. Another card our opponent could also have access to is potentially Blood Moon. So we maybe should have fetched around that in the early turns. Cycling, we find Foundation Breaker. We go ahead and fetch Basic Island. Once again, should have fetched Basic Forest, but now we should go after Leyline here. Yep. Although Ether Vial is threatening. Opponent vials in. They have Chalice. Okay. Kind of hard to fight through this much hate. It finds Snoop, so we will be dead here in a couple of turns if we don't do anything. So we have to cycle, because we can't cast Violent Outburst into Living End through a Chalice. So our opponent does the Matron thing. They show us yet another Leyline on the top of their deck. They get Harbinger. They get Ringleader on top of their deck. And so Harbinger will be able to go get Kiki-Jiki. Kiki-Jiki will get to go nuts next turn. Now obviously I could buy a turn with Colossal Sky Turtle, but you know, we're at the point here where we need both another answer to Chalice and you know, to dodge the combo for a couple turns, and that doesn't seem extremely likely. That said, we do have one more cycle I probably should have done, see if we could find Foundation Breaker. So possibly premature concession here, as Colossal Sky Turtle obviously can go return target creature to its owner's hand, bouncing Conspicuous Snoop, buying us a turn, but I digress. So upon further reflection, I made some changes to the sideboarding. We boarded out the Leyline of the Voids, boarded back in the Griefs. I guess they're a little bit better on the play. Still left in a couple of Force of Negations, potentially cashed an Ether Vial or Chalice, as you know, it's difficult when your opponent has multiple different angles of attack. Alright, so we have Living End, Grief, so we have the ability to disrupt our opponent if they don't have Leyline, if they're on a Chalice hand. We have several Cyclers, so I think this hand's a fairly reasonable keep, although our opponent mulligans to 6. They lead off on Leyline. We go ahead and Grief them. They have Ether Vial, Boggart, Harbinger, and Conspicuous Snoop. We take Snoop because it's the most threatening card in their hand, although you could argue you could take Ether Vial. We cycle. We draw another Grief. We have Violent Outburst, which at least it'll be a Wrath, but at the same time, we're not getting any value of it. So opponent's got off for a Horde Master. We play a land, use the waves, get a Grief, get a Sky Turtle, cycle. We have an Unclaimed Territory in hand. And now we're in lots and lots of trouble. We have another Horde Master. Opponent starts beating down. We're at 9 already, or 11. And if we happen to living in, our opponent gets the combo to kill us, so kind of backed ourselves into a corner here. At this point, I believe I conceded. It was possible I should have just hard cast Shardless Agent to try to block. Now, keeping in mind, our opponent's going to get, 2 dying triggers if they attack with this, so, it's possible you're just always supposed to presume your opponent has the hard graveyard hate, especially with a deck that's shown you game 2 that's packing ley line. It's possible you're supposed to hard mulligan to some type of answer for it. If you're not running Brazen Borrower, which this version is not, you're kind of down to Foundation Breaker. So, yeah, that's it. Let's get on to match number 3. All right, we're back for match number 3. We are on the play again, which is always nice. Opening hand, bunch of cyclers, Violent Outburst, kind of hard to pass up on this. Go ahead and lead off on Shocking Steam Vents. Opponent leads off on Triome Pass. We cycle a bunch of stuff. I guess we do not. But our opponent leads on Polluted Delta. We get a that cycle Striped Riverwinder, leaving Force of Negation backup for when we go through a Violent Outburst during their turn. Opponent plays and passes. We go cycle, cast Violent Outburst. Our opponent responds with probably some type of counterspell here. Nope, they respond with Kaya's Guile? Yep, Kaya's Guile here. So, or at least trying to put the idea of something along those lines in our hand. So since they showed us Watery Grave, that leads me to believe that they are on Esper Control, which their form of hate is things like Kaya's Guile, Kaya herself, that kind of stuff. So interesting that we run into Esper Control, not a deck you see a lot these days, but is something worth noting that our opponent fetched and showed us information that they probably shouldn't have, but especially if they were just going to concede anyway. All right, preparing for for game number 2. So, presuming our opponent is on Esper Control from what they showed us, cards we can expect to see: Teferi Time Reveler, Kaya's Guile, Kaya herself, possibly Leyline, possibly Rest in Peace. So, presuming our opponent's hate is more spell-based or planeswalker-based, we choose to bring in our subtleties and our mystical disputes, go down a little bit of everything: 1 Force of Negation, 1 Grief, a Street Wraith, a Striped Riverwinder, and a Waker of Waves. So kind of hedging a little bit, shaving a little bit here and there. Once again, if there's a more proper thing to actually mulligan in these style matchups, please let me know down in the comments. I can improve upon that in future gameplay with Living End. So, taking a look at our opening hand, we have Disruption for our opponent in the form of Grief, a couple Cyclers, hand seems pretty reasonable, and another Warrior potentially to bounce a Planeswalker if it comes to kind of a draw-go-ish game. We go ahead and play Botanical Sanctum. No reason to cast Grief until we're closer to turn 3 with the Teferi. Opponent once again showing us more lands, so they could just be blue-white control. So we cast a Grief. They have showed us Dovin's Veto, Teferi and Kaya's Guile, so our opponent had two graveyard answers and one counter spell. So we have stuff we need to play around here. Our opponent doesn't jam Teferi, which I find interesting. I guess they're afraid of Mystical Dispute or something. Just kind of plays into our buying for time. But opponent holding up their Dovin's Veto to save their life, it looks like here. We go ahead and cycle Striped Riverwinder. We then draw into the Mystical Dispute. Go ahead and fetch Shock, which I probably shouldn't have done until my opponent's turn. But, yeah. I think we hardcast Subtlety here just to get pressure on the battlefield. Our opponent seems stuck on lands. I think it's kind of hard whether to keep Otawara in our hand or not, because we could potentially go like Curator of Mysteries, hold up Mystical Dispute, but Otawara at least allows us to bounce their Planeswalker. Force of Negation, once again, we kind of go with this weird pseudo-tempo plan that sometimes works with this deck. We cast the Curator of Mysteries and they hard counter spell, which is fine. We were going to run into that at some point anyway. Opponent goes Thoughtseize, they take our Violent Outburst. They continue to hold up their mana. Go ahead and attack with Subtlety, just continuing to pressure them. Once again, we have no reason to take a game action, as they're the ones stuck on mana, not us, and we're the ones with the clock. So, hit them for 3. Go ahead and cast Curator here. They attempt to Archmage's Charm it. We Mystical Dispute. This might have been incorrect, but now they get to resolve Teferi, and, well, if they draw a land, they get to resolve Teferi. They go for, looks like Supreme Verdict, which is fine, because then we get to resolve Shardless Agent, and should win us the game. And we resolve Living End, and do a whole bunch of things. Get to take something from their hand, and our opponent concedes. So, nice end to our 3-match stretch with blue Living End. Deck is obviously very solid. It's one of the top 10, top 15 decks in the format. Obviously, as we've seen, especially in the Goblins matchup, it is vulnerable to a myriad of different hate pieces. It can play a weird tempo game sometimes. The version that I was playing was a little bit different than ones I've played previously. I think ones I've played previously was more heavier on like endurances and things. So I'm not sure what build is the correct one. I know when I tend to play decks I'm not as familiar with, I tend to play a more stock or streamlined version of the deck. And I know Subtlety has been a huge thing for the deck of late. It answers a lot of different things. It slows down the opponent. It helps in the scan matchup, etc. So I'm not sure which version I'm the fan of, but once again, I'm hardly a Living End master. That's more Mignonne's end of things. He continues to put up a ton of trophies almost every season with just basically playing Living End. So, you know, it helps to have a master out there of the deck. And most archetypes in Modern generally have somebody who's a noted pilot of them. I'm more noted for playing Burn or decks like Murktide, or is it Phoenix in the past? So, you know, sometimes you gotta test decks not necessarily in your wheelhouse and see how they feel. In this deck, Game 1 obviously almost always feels great. Game 2 and Game 3, gotta learn to fight through the hate. That's the one area that's a struggle for me with this deck. Learning what to sideboard, not sideboard, etc. So, things you need to learn when you're playing the deck, but it does give you some idea of how the deck plays out, and a little bit of someone who's more intermediate with the deck, how the deck is capable of performing. So, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hope to see you for next Monday's deck guide.